Thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Ashlee Christoffersen, I believe Dr. Ashlee Christoffersen, from my understanding, if that's correct, who is a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh, where her research is concerned with the historic and contemporary operationalisation of the Black feminist theory of intersectionality in equality policy and practice, its influence and possibilities, as well as the discursive and material resistance it faces. She's also an independent equality research consultant working mainly in the E&D, equality and diversity in higher education sector as well. So really excited to be joining conversation with you, Ashlee, today to talk about all things intersectionality from your experience, where you kind of came into contact with it and how you've used it in your work, and just kind of your thoughts and reflections on it more broadly in the current world we live in today, if that's okay. Um, so I'll pass the mic over to you if you want to perhaps talk a little bit about when you first came into contact with intersectionality as we know it now, and how has it shaped kind of you and perhaps your work as well.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, well, first of all, thank you very much, Erin, for organizing this and for speaking with me today. So maybe I'll just start with a little bit of background about me. Yeah, so I've recently completed a PhD exploring understandings and uses of intersectionality in policy and practice. And this was based on, to the best of my knowledge, the first study internationally to explore how both practitioners and policymakers kind of themselves understand intersectionality and how they operationalize it or perceive themselves to operationalize it. And this research, which I'll speak a bit more about, was conducted with 3 networks of equality organizations in both England and Scotland here in the UK. So racial justice, feminist, disability rights, LGBTI rights, and refugee organizations, as well as kind of intersectional organizations, combinations of those. And yeah, so I did multi-method qualitative case studies of the networks and also spoke with equality policymakers as well. I'm currently looking at the relationship between race equality and gender equality legislation, as well as the influence and silencing of Black and women of color theory and activism, kind of including intersectionality in the development of the Sex Discrimination Act and the Equal Pay Act, and their kind of the Equality Act, which followed those acts, as part of a big project called Gender Equalities at Work. So before I did a PhD, I worked at the Equality Challenge Unit, which is now Advance HE, as a researcher. And in that role, I developed a guide on applying intersectionality in research and data analysis for equality and diversity practitioners in both higher education and further education. And as a team at the Equality Challenge Unit, we really tried to kind of operationalize intersectionality in our research. But this was really challenging, in part due to the way the organization was organized, which kind of reflects siloed policy and practice more widely. So I've now actually worked in 2 organizations that had a kind of race equality officer, gender, disability, and so on and so forth, kind of across the protected characteristics of the Equality Act. And that makes it really challenging to apply intersectionality, because those people don't necessarily speak with one another that much or necessarily kind of work together that much, though they might do. It's kind of not necessarily set up in that way when everyone has responsibility for different inequalities. And before that, I worked at a London-based LGBTQ community development organization, which was really tried to apply intersectionality, although we didn't necessarily use that term the whole time that I worked there. But the organization kind of purposefully developed to be Black-led among its trustees during my time there, and our work was directed at the overlapping groups of Black, female, deaf, and disabled LGBTQ people. And before that, I conducted research on the kind of relationship between intersectionality and the Equality Act back in 2006 to kind of 2008, so before the Equality Act was passed. And again, with colleagues, we repeated that research around kind of 2014. Um, yeah, so I'll kind of try to speak a bit from all of these experiences. In terms of when I first came into contact with kind of the term intersectionality, for me, I guess it was back when I was at university in kind of the early 2000s. And yeah, and I came across it as both an activist and as a student. Yeah.
And I mean, firstly, it's your range of experience and utilization of intersectionality across from that very operational and the research and collecting data, but also through straight to the policy and legislative context. It really kind of showcases that the metaphor, the theory itself spans across so many different functions and complexities in that, which I think is just really illustrated in your career today, which I think is really, really exciting. So just kind of going back to the early 2000s, if that's okay. You said you kind of came into contact with it as sort of a student and as an activist, and that'd just be great to kind of hear a little bit about that experience and what that meant to you, if that's okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, around that time, while I was a student at university, I sat on the board of a kind of student run social justice center. And it was mainly white people on the board at that time, although this was in Vancouver, in Canada, where I'm from originally, which is actually a very kind of diverse city. And one of the staff, who was a woman of color, was kind of in hindsight hugely frustrated with the kind of lack of anti racist analysis and white privilege evident among the trustees, the directors of the board at that time. And this was like 100% applicable to myself as well as the kind of group as a whole. So she started an anti-racism reading group specifically for white staff, board members, and other kind of volunteers and activists. And we read things like Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McClintock. I don't know, have you read that?
Yeah.
Uh, that really stuck with me. Yeah, I still go back to that article often. Um, and around the same time, I started to learn about intersectionality and probably came across the term in the context of women's studies and political science courses. Um, Actually, the kind of core women's studies courses were very kind of second wave. So I remember actually learning in women's studies that all women in the world have more in common with one another than they have with men. And I remember actually saying that to a partner at the time who was just like, that's ridiculous. But I was repeating what I had learned. Um, yeah. So, but I was fortunate that in the program there were other options which were delivered primarily by precariously employed women of color, which would kind of fall into what we would now call intersectionality studies, which at the time was called kind of race, class, and gender studies. So for me, kind of coming into contact with intersectionality was, not a difficult, at times difficult process of kind of unlearning and self-reflection and recognizing my own privilege and, problematic things that I had kind of done and not really thought about very much in my life, kind of becoming committed to anti-racist and Indigenous solidarity activism. I was also really fortunate to work with people like Harsha Walia, who's now kind of world famous and rightfully so, and other amazing activists and scholars in Vancouver. And I worked with an organization that, although I didn't use the word intersectionality, um, our kind of core belief was that those with the most to gain from social change, which we imagined as women of color and we were led by women of color, will be the kind of leaders of any social change. So those with the most to gain will necessarily be the ones kind of leading struggles for social change, which I still very much believe. And so, yeah, for me, it was a lot about kind of figuring out how to do that activism, that anti racist activism, in kind of appropriate ways as a white person. I was also kind of understanding myself as bisexual, kind of coming out at that time, and recognizing myself as coming from a working class background, feeling the first in my family to attend university, feeling at times kind of very out of place at the university. So for me, once I'd kind of got to grips with intersectionality, it was also like a real kind of aha moment where it just kind of clicked to be able to see how different inequality structures kind of operate to create different aspects of identity and to really describe the kind of complexity of both privilege and oppression. And it just made a huge amount of sense for lots of reasons. Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I definitely connect with some of that personal realizations in some ways. Being myself being gay and South Asian, those things are always in conflict sometimes when I was growing up. And then when I started to get to know intersectionality, it was like, oh yeah, that now I understand why I'm in this constant state of conflict. So it's in line to hear that actually embracing intersectionality does provide those aha moments. It helps you make sense of those tensions that exist within us as people as well. There was something that you kind of mentioned around, and I think you mentioned this in sort of the work you're doing as well around this. I don't know whether we want to call it sort of a competing inequality between gender and race. And we've seen it written about that gender sometimes trumps race, and they're kind of positioned sometimes as versus, one against another in some ways. I just wondered, speaking to some of the experience you've had, and also some of the work you're doing and the kind of the Equality Act as well, perhaps, if you've got any reflections around, how does intersectionality shed light on those disparities between gender and race, and any thoughts about how we might align those in some ways or reduce that competition?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, so yeah, first of all, I would say that uh, these are not mutually exclusive categories. Of course, gender and race are always overlapping and shaping one another. Um, but that understanding, uh, you know, is marginalized. The understanding of the inequalities in that way is really marginalized across kind of policy, practice, and academia, really. And there's a lot of vested interests, particularly my research found among white feminists, both historically and like in the present day, in um, yeah, in keeping these separate. So, for example, in my research right now, I'm actually looking at the very early days of the Sex Discrimination Act. And yeah, kind of little did I know, even as someone who'd kind of done a lot of research about the Equality Act, that there was talk of kind of unifying race and gender legislation back in the 1960s. So, before there was any gender equality legislation, but there was the Race Relations Act. Um, and yeah, so different political actors at the time wanted kind of one, some wanted kind of one act, one equality body, like we have now in the form of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, but not because of intersectionality, because they thought that it would allow for kind of parity of powers and procedures across these two areas. But so, yeah, so some political actors wanted kind of unity at that time, but still made no reference to the fact that these intersect. Um, but white feminists and white female parliamentarians at the time were very opposed to this, uh, and so that's kind of where we started from, where the first equality legislation that we had in the UK was actually around race. Um, but gender achieved a primacy, which continues to be perceived by many working in equality. So I'm really interested in exploring further kind of how we got to that point. But a lot of it is going to come down to the kind of actions, campaigning, motivations of white feminists. And now we're kind of in a situation where a lot of white feminists and white-led and predominantly white feminist organizations, not only in the UK but kind of across Europe and in North America, they kind of claim to be the ones really doing intersectionality. So there was obviously a huge white feminist appropriation of intersectionality, and feminist organizations claim that they're the ones really doing it as compared with other equality sectors. But when we look closer, I think that might not be the case. Yeah.
No, it's really interesting. And do you think there's elements of kind of like colonialism with some of the white feminist movements, and how that's, I guess there's been kind of debates, I guess, around the colonization of intersectionality, or what some people have
Mhm.
also referred to as the whitewashing of intersectionality. Is that something that you've perhaps seen, or kind of in some of the work that you've done, and some of the things you hear about as well, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, that is 100% what is coming across when we kind of historicize it. So again, looking back at debates that were happening in the 1960s in the UK, this was coming very much from a imperialist colonial position where Black women and women of color were imagined only as immigrants to the UK. Um, and there was just, yeah, like a total white supremacy in the ways in which women of color are talked about by white feminists at that time. Just, yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I'm sure that we can still, I'm sure that we can still see that today. Absolutely.
That's really interesting. And I was just thinking, so if we kind of shift away a little bit from the kind of policy and legislative aspect, because a lot of policy change and legislation is led by evidence and data, and the, lots and lots of research and intel and census data and all kinds of things that kind of come into play. I guess there's a bit of a question around how do we get to a place where we have good, how do we integrate intersectionality in terms of good research and good data in that respect to inform some of those policy decisions or legislative changes? It'd be great to kind of get your thoughts on what does that look like? What is the ideal, I guess, in that respect for intersectionality
Mhm.
or that evidence gathering bit for those informing those conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's really complex because I guess when we think about data, this kind of brings us to the heart of what Andre Hancock has kind of described as intersectionality's ontological project, the kind of challenge that it presents, because we collect data on individual characteristics. And then the way in which we organize that data and the way in which we analyze that data suggests that they're mutually exclusive. So even when we kind of combine them, looking at kind of crosstabs of, for example, gender and race, um, fundamentally, these are still exist in our data sets as kind of separate categories. And there are ways that, for example, Andre Hancock has suggested of kind of trying to mitigate this. One being through use of kind of fuzzy set methodology as one possible way. All of this, all kind of considering all of this, inevitably makes any of the research that we do, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, much more complicated by necessity. And I think, yeah, we as kind of people committed to intersectionality are really still kind of figuring this out, as I'm sure that you will know from your own experiences and research. But I guess, yeah, to go back to your question, I mean, at the very minimum, what we need to be doing is looking at these kind of crosstabs, looking at data, as kind of collecting data and looking at it in as finely grained way as possible. So always looking at kind of intersections of ideally, not just two characteristics, but, more characteristics at the same time. But I think it's also really important not to get completely bogged down in the need for kind of quantitative data, because one of the kind of narratives that is produced around that and that we hear from policymakers is that intersectionally marginalized groups, and particularly specific ones, are small and they're not statistically significant, and so on and so forth. So um, yeah, we have to kind of be aware of that. And some intersectionally marginalized groups are numerically small. That doesn't mean that we can't create statistically significant and reliable evidence about them. However, it's really important to also use qualitative methods and to just always be sending the message that regardless of if a community is numerically small, it is important. And in fact, if we put, the smallest, most intersectionally marginalized group at the center of our kind of policymaking or whatever it is we're doing, then those who are kind of singularly disadvantaged, as Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, noted, will also benefit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I guess statistical analyses and significant differences can only take you so far in that interpretation. When you do have to kind of look beyond the numbers, you do need to have an interpretative lens on the data as well. Um, and I also wonder as well, because when we talk about or think about kind of saying, yes, you need to think about integrating intersectionality in terms of the way you're doing your research and the evidence gathering, there's sometimes a bit of resistance because people, well, one, it does take quite a bit of time to go through the process, particularly if you're working with groups or teams that are maybe not as well versed in it. I just wondered how you've kind of integrated intersectionality in terms of your research process, and perhaps working with those that may not be as well versed in it as yourself, and how you brought them along with you, perhaps.
Mhm. That's a good question. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I guess we can start small, So one way of applying intersectionality or thinking about intersectionality is at levels of inclusion and access to research in the first instance. So making sure that everything that we do is really accessible to the target group. And that can be, obviously, we live in a kind of COVID-19 world now, but kind of back in the day, uh, doing things like focus groups in person, it's about thinking about the timing of those. Do they conflict with, any religious holidays across minority religions? Space that's accessible, paying, giving people some compensation for their time, those kinds of things. Yeah, so I think, uh, yeah, it's people get on board at that level because they obviously see the benefits of inclusion of people in research. So that's kind of one way. Yeah, and I guess more recently for me in my PhD research, um, thinking about applying intersectionality in research is really thinking about kind of methodologically. Um, for me, has been really thinking about including all or not including many different markers of inequality in research. So for my particular research, which was looking primarily at equality third sector organizations, it meant including all sectors within that. Whereas a lot of intersectional research has really prioritized gender and kind of the study of feminist movements. So, part for me, how we apply intersectionality methodologically is displacing that privileging of gender and meaningfully including, obviously, race, but also sexuality, disability, migrant status in our research. Yeah, whether that's thinking about individual participants or thinking about kind of organizations. And we can do that in research, even research that's focused on a specific issue. So I've carried out a lot of research projects that have been focused on gender and or race, where the kind of target group of participants was either Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, or women. But we can still absolutely think about recruiting across all of these different markers of inequality and considering them in our analysis. Yeah.
That's really great, and I think it's really insightful commentary on that aspect of how you kind of think about intersectionality through the research process. One of the things that we learn and kind of know about intersectionality, I guess, in some ways, is that it's used as a tool to create action or to support the development of meaningful interventions and for social change in some ways. And I think some people, from people that I've talked to outside of like the intersectional bubble, I guess in some ways,
Mhm.
is how you go on to create action. How do you draw out from that intersectionality kind of piece of work or evidence gathering you do? How do you actually go on to create those interventions that mean change? And I wonder if you've had experience, kind of reflections around what does it mean to have kind of an intersectional intervention or action piece around it? And I think that's something even for myself developing sort of intersectional interventions, it's still always a challenge. But just thinking about from your perspective on what that on what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of my conclusions is that, well, obviously, as we've kind of discussed already, there are really different ways of applying intersectionality for different purposes. And there isn't kind of one general way of doing it. It's very context specific. Um, and that's kind of part of what intersectionality is. So intersectional type interventions can look very kind of different from one another. Having said that, so I guess in my research, I found that um, in kind of UK equality policy and equality third sector organizing, there's kind of five different ways that the term intersectionality, yeah, that people perceive themselves as applying intersectionality in kind of five broad kind of ways. And I probably won't run through them all now, but I guess one of my kind of conclusions and takeaway messages is that it involves focusing both on issues that are common to differently marginalized groups. Uh, so, for example, some of my research participants developed kind of coalitional work on hate crime across different inequalities. Um, as well as mental health as an issue which affects differently marginalized groups. So those are kind of two potential examples of issues. So it's focusing on common issues, but within that, focusing on intersectionally marginalized experiences. And yeah, the other fundamental thing is that where we should be looking for leadership from is from kind of intersectionally marginalized groups, and in particular, autonomous organizations of and by them, who tend to be really underfunded in the UK equality sector, where, you know, in my view, these organizations should be absolutely the kind of top priority for funding and leadership. And there's been a lot of focus on how organizations and institutions which are not run by and for intersectionally marginalized groups can better include those groups. And maybe that's the wrong question. So, you know, it's not about including those groups and organizations that are run by those who are more intersectionally privileged, but rather how we can take leadership from those groups. Um, yeah, and yeah, by looking at their autonomous organizing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point around actually investment from the country in underrepresented organizations, and particularly in the equality sphere as well, because some of them organizations are so amazing in terms of lobbying for change, some of their research that they produce. Particularly, I'm just thinking about the third sector, some of the third sector kind of groups and smaller charities led by Black and Asian minority ethnic groups are so ahead of the curve, and are really kind of innovative in terms of how they try to gain their funding, because they don't have the same access to a lot of the
Mhm.
big trusts or donors in that respect as well. So yeah, I think it's good to flip the question around, rather than thinking about what more can such groups do to get funding. Is about how can we encourage funders or people to invest in. And I think it speaks a little bit to this part around, and I think the Runnymede Trust have done this as well, around building a case for racial justice. What is the investment around that? What is the benefits around that? And going back to kind of like quite prudishly sort of an economic analysis of it in some ways,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
which is kind of a shame that we have to do that, but it seems to be the world we're in at the moment, to
Mhm.
kind of build that in. The question I wanted to ask was around how you've mitigated using language around critical race theory or intersectionality, and other such kind of like similar terms when you're trying to bid for research funding or grants, and things like that. Just following on from our conversation about some of the problems
Yeah.
that we see around investment in anti-racist work or intersectionality themed work as well. So it'd be
Mhm.
great to get on that, please.
Mhm. Yeah. So, when I bid for funding in the field of intersectionality, like I do so as a white woman, who, has a lot more privilege than other people potentially bidding for, uh, Black, Asian, minority ethnic people bidding for funding for the same work. So I'm coming from a particular context. On the one hand, I think intersectionality is quite popular at the moment, particularly given recent Black Lives Matter movements. But on the other hand, I actually have found it really difficult with some funders to kind of communicate why it's important. So, yeah, I guess we kind of talk amongst ourselves and we know why it is important, but it can be hard to communicate to, powerful funding organizations why it's important. Definitely, yeah. Um,
Can I ask what perhaps some of your strategies around that? Does that change the way you look, where you look for, well, for funding and investment for perhaps, or are there opportunities to challenge prospective investors, or kind of donors or funders and things like that in some of the work?
mhm. Um, yeah, that's a good question. I'm just thinking back to my experience working in the voluntary sector as well. Yeah, we certainly did, make decisions about who we were going to apply for funding to based on what we knew of their kind of politics around equalities work. Um, Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes, there can be advocates in unlikely places. So it's not necessarily that you have to go for kind of public funding all of the time to do this kind of work. But yeah, it's about, I guess, finding those individuals within organizations, really, yeah, who might be advocates because they might have their own personal experiences of marginalization or intersectional marginalization.
I did have kind of maybe a bit of a blue sky question for you as well. Actually, you've been working in the realm of intersectionality and equality and anti-racism for quite some time now, and across different contexts as well, and cultures, from what it sounds like too. I just kind of wondered, what's kind of your I know, I understand that everyone that's a lot of people that are involved with this kind of work understand it's a marathon. It's something that takes time for change. But I guess for you, what's the kind of ideal kind of intersectional world, or kind of context in which you would like to see, in that respect? And yeah, it'd be great to get kind of your big picture vision for that, if that's okay.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really hard question, and it can become hard to even imagine that when you're kind of bogged down working in different institutional cultures and finding it really hard to even see possibilities for small reforms, let alone kind of like grand social change. But ideally, I guess, as I've mentioned, um, leadership would come from those who are most marginalized, and the world would be kind of structured around their needs and interests and capacities, and everyone will benefit that way. Yeah. And it also involves a lot of obviously working across difference and having conversations across difference, which can be challenging, but it's also, hugely fulfilling. Yeah.
No, this is a nice. Sometimes we can forget. I think when we're so invested in intersecting oppressions and structural inequalities that there is a there's something bigger that we're all trying to work towards. And I think that understanding that is always really important, and understanding why we can celebrate difference rather than be afraid of it as well, which I think is a really nice message. I just want to ask you as well now, like just thinking about kind of your experience, both personally and professionally, what would be kind of your take home or kind of key messages around intersectionality, for those perhaps maybe not as invested in it as
Yeah.
some of come across, and even for some of those that are very invested in it, I suppose perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be great to get your reflections on that.
Sure. So intersectionality is incredibly urgent, in Kimberly Crenshaw's words, and she said that, I think it was in 2016, and it's even more urgent now. And it's urgent precisely because when we're doing equalities work with a single issue approach, we're not making progress. What we're doing is we're actually exacerbating inequalities within groups. So, for example, if we take a single issue approach to gender, do work which is uh, predominantly benefiting white and otherwise privileged women, what we're doing is we're exacerbating inequalities among women. We're not, we're not making progress on equalities when we're not doing intersectionality. We're furthering intersectional marginalization, and that's why it's incredibly important. So it's something we can kind of think about as a kind of afterthought or a kind of secondary consideration, but it has to be absolutely at the center of equalities work. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It's been such a great conversation, albeit with a couple of technical glitches. But thank you again for your time and sharing your expertise with myself and people that will watch this as well. So really, really appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for organizing this and organizing the series. And it's been really great to speak to you.